Well, can I say to my honourable friend that there's a lot that we are doing and we're trying to do to alleviate the humanitarian suffering. We provided additional funding for UK Med. I did that within the first weeks in office. We've match funded the Disaster Emergency Committee's appeal. That's £10 million to date. We are supporting Jordan, who want to do airdrops, and we've supported them with their planning. So we are doing everything we can to alleviate the suffering. But as he knows, the trucks are backed up. There is food sitting on the border that comes from the British taxpayer. It is that that's unacceptable. It's that I raised again with Foreign Minister Katz, and we will continue to press on. The aid needs to get in now. He reassured me this weekend that it will do. That was his reassurance. As we head to winter, with the Knesset voting today on UNRWA, the urgency of this debate that we are having in this House could not be more necessary.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office share my view that none of this dreadful cycle, which began on October the 7th, would have happened but for Iran's determination to derail the prospect of peace between and recognition between Saudi Arabia and Israel? And what assessment has his department made of the possibility that one day the Iranian people will be able to free themselves of the terrible regime under which they suffer?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right that this story begins on October the 7th, and it is really important that we keep in mind that Hamas is a proxy funded and supported by Iran, that Hezbollah is a proxy funded and supported by Iran, and that the Houthis too, causing huge disruption at the moment in the Red Sea, are funded and supported by Iran. And that Iran is a regime that commits all sorts of atrocities on its own people, that suppresses freedom of speech, that suppresses women, the list goes on. He's absolutely right to centre Iran as the major threat to the region.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, on Saturday, the UN's Acting Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator stated that the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. What Israeli forces are doing in besieged North Gaza cannot be allowed to continue. Does the Foreign Secretary agree, and what representations has he made to the Israeli government to this effect?
I reminded the Israeli government that 42,000 people have now been killed, that more than 90% of the population has been displaced, many of them now repeatedly since 2023, that as we head to a winter, as we have been unable to ensure effective and safe distribution of aid across Gaza, that with that we need to increase the volumes of the types of goods also that are reaching Gaza, and we've got to stop restricting the aid flows, and that there is a responsibility under international humanitarian law to protect the civilian population, to minimise harms to civilian and civilian infrastructure, and to ensure that aid workers can go about their business free and unfettered.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Deputy Speaker, can I just take the Foreign Secretary back to the issue of Iran specifically? we used to agree with each other a lot when he was in opposition on this matter, so I'm going to probe him a little bit further if he doesn't mind. Back in 2023, he quite rightly, and the opposition, called for that Iran should actually basically not just be sanctioned, but should be ruled out legally for any actions at all, and making all actions and involvement with them illegal, prescribed. I supported him in that moment, and I wasn't supportive of my own government. So I want to ask him this particular question. Given all the billions that they've spent, which could have gone to health and building and all the quality of life, instead of which went to tunnels, missiles and violence all over the region, is it not time now, in his mind, to follow through and prescribe Iran completely with our allies and say this must never happen again?
Yeah.
One, the right honourable gentleman raises a serious issue, and it is why the Home Secretary and I are looking far closer at what it means to bear down on a state that is causing the activity that he describes, rather than a terrorist cell that is causing it. So most often when we're discussing these issues in this chamber, we are talking about Hamas or Hezbollah or some terrorist cell. Here we are talking about a state which does mean more complex things come to bear, including, of course, our own presence in that state. And for those reasons, we're looking at that more with more thorough examination.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary will no doubt agree with me that third states, such as the UK, are obliged not to assist Israel in its annihilation of the Gazan people. Israel continues to target the cynically named safe zones, schools, hospitals, in its war of extermination. Whilst the UK has suspended only 30 out of 90 licences for the export of arms to the Israeli military, our continued participation in the F-35 global supply chain means that devastating 2,000-pound bombs continue to destroy human beings. And he asks the right question: what must parents say to their children, and how do they explain this living nightmare? Are they not right to also ask, where was the international community when we needed them? Why did they not use all of the levers available to them to ban those arms sales, to use the leverage of recognition of Palestine, and to impose sanctions to concentrate minds?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that he will understand that we sell relatively little arms to Israel. I think it's 1% of the total amount. And much that we send is defensive in nature. It's not what you would describe routinely as arms, because the licensing regime is actually about controlled equipment, which is not always arms. But we have suspended arms that could be used in Israel in contravention of humanitarian law. I made that decision, and I think it was the right decision. And we continue, as I've said, to do all we can to support the people of Gaza. And I'm deeply, deeply sad that I and my predecessors have not been able to bring this crisis and this war to an end. That saddens me greatly. But if he evokes my conscience, I do believe that I'm doing all that I can according to my conscience.
Kit Malthouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If, as everybody expects, the Israeli government ignores the pleadings of the Foreign Secretary and our allies and proceeds with the dismantling of UNRWA, making their job impossible, what will he do next? Will there be any consequence whatsoever for the Israeli government?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say, when I raised this issue with Foreign Minister Katz yesterday, he was at pains to explain to me that whilst Parliament could pass this bill today, the Knesset could pass this bill today in Israel, it did not mean it had to be implemented. And so I think we must hold out that the Israeli government does not implement this legislation because it's not in their interests. It cannot be in their interests for the only aid organisation, not just providing healthcare but also schools for young people, and of course working not just in Gaza but also in the occupied territories. It simply cannot be in their interests to do this because they would have to then provide that themselves.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today and I strongly support the government's efforts to achieve a ceasefire, secure the release of remaining hostages and restart the negotiations for a two-state solution. And I also welcome the decision by the government several weeks ago, to suspend a number of arms export licences to Israel where there was a risk they would be used to violate international law. Can my right honourable friend confirm that the UK is working hard to persuade our allies, particularly the United States, to adopt our position on arms exports to Israel, to ensure no weapons are being exported from any country where there is a risk they could be used to commit war crimes in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, we have amongst the most robust export licensing regime in the world. It is our legislation, and so it isn't the case that I have been proselytising to other countries to do what we have done. I did it because I believe that there was a clear risk that international humanitarian law was being breached in relation to our legislation. That is why I made the decision. It must be for others to reflect on their own laws and rules.
Brendan O'Hara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, after a weekend of relentless Israeli attacks on a besieged civilian population in northern Gaza, the United Nations has demanded that such blatant disregard for basic humanity and for the laws of war must stop, adding that the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. So unless he believes that the UN is lying, exaggerating, embellishing the situation in northern Gaza, unless he believes that, there can be no basis whatsoever for the UK to continue arms sales to Israel. So, Foreign Secretary, is the UN lying, exaggerating or embellishing the truth of what's going on in northern Gaza right now?
Foreign Secretary.
The UN is absolutely not embellishing what is going on in Gaza right now, very, very sadly. And that is why the United Kingdom have suspended arms sales for use in Gaza.
Clive Betts.
Madam Deputy Speaker, isn't the issue, Foreign Secretary, that despite all the requests and all the pleading, the Israeli government ignores requests to allow aid into Gaza? It ignores requests to stop the destruction of Gaza. It ignores requests to stop settler violence in the West Bank. Now, congratulate the Foreign Secretary on the sanctions against settlers and settler organisations engaged in that violence. Will he now extend the sanctions to members of the Israeli government who have been promoting violence in the West Bank? And will he also look if the Israeli government actually carries out restrictions on UNRWA in a formalised way, that members of the government who agree to that should also be sanctioned for that? Otherwise, aren't we just issuing empty threats and empty words that the Israelis ignore?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend will know that I have condemned in no uncertain terms, both as Shadow Foreign Secretary and as Foreign Secretary, some of the vile language that's been used by extremist elements within the Israeli government. I heard the former Foreign Secretary on the radio talking about sanctions that could have been implemented, that he chose not to implement, but I can assure him that I'm keeping those sanctions under review.
Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's been a held belief across all governments that a two-state solution is the only way that the cycle of violence is going to be broken. But of course, after Israel withdrew from Gaza, that pretty much led to what happened on October the 7th. So may I ask the Foreign Secretary whether he can use his office and the UK government to proactively lead discussions as a friend to Israel and a key member of the United Nations as to what security can be put in place in a two-state solution using allies around and making sure that Israel can have the confidence that if that is developed it won't be used as an attack platform to murder so many people once more.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, we continue to hold out for that two-state solution. And it's definitely the case that Arab partners want to see that two-state solution. I think amongst them, at this stage, Saudi Arabia is very, very important. I know that Israel would like to normalise relations with Saudi Arabia, but I think the Honourable Gentleman knows that that is unlikely unless there is a roadmap to two states. And so we continue to work with all partners to keep two states alive, and of course the security concerns that Israel would need to be satisfied to bring that about.
Phil Brickell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The current situation in northern Gaza is dreadful. I welcome the leading role the government has played in providing essential humanitarian relief to Gaza. That includes through support packages for UNRWA, UNICEF, the World Health Organization and others. Following discussions I had last week with the Honourable Member for Lincoln, does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that Israeli restrictions on the flow of essential aid are completely unacceptable and should be lifted immediately?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes, 100%. And I made that point to Foreign Minister Katz yesterday. They are unacceptable, and I condemn them.
Shokat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the past year, Israeli occupying forces have destroyed every facet of Palestinian lives, targeting lives, homes, schools, universities, hospitals, mosques, and even churches. In fact, enacting Israel's Defense Secretary's exact words to eliminate everything. Will the Foreign Secretary now look beyond his conscience and immediately seize the provision of military support to Israel, suspend all export licenses, and impose a two-way arms embargoes so no more children can die? Thank you.
Well, I really accept the heartfelt way in which the Honourable Gentleman puts his question, but let me just say that we have suspended arms that could be used in Gaza in the way that he has described. That is what we have done. And I stand by that decision.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The situation in northern Gaza is beyond desperate, with many reports of actions which have every appearance of aiming to empty this territory of its entire population, and the UN humanitarian chief, Joyce Msuya, warning that the entire population is at risk of dying. This strategy of the Israeli government is intolerable, and it has also failed on its own terms because the hostages have not been released, as we all want to see. Can the Foreign Secretary say what happens next? What further meaningful action the UK government is planning to take to safeguard lives in northern Gaza and secure an immediate ceasefire?
Foreign Secretary.
She evokes the hostages, and it allows me just to put on record Emily Damari, the hostage, the UK hostage, and our desire to see her freed. And can I reassure my honourable friend, we convened at the UN Security Council last week a meeting on humanitarian access. We issued a statement just yesterday with colleagues from the G7, some colleagues from the G7, certainly Japan, Germany, South Korea were amongst those number, urging Israel to step back on the UNRWA decision.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
It is important to acknowledge that Israel is often first on the scene when there's a humanitarian crisis internationally, and is generous even in countries that don't recognise it. However, it must do more to ensure aid gets into Gaza. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it's not good enough for a country like ours simply to be generous, which it is? It must also ensure that its generosity is not diverted into the hands of proxies, particularly Hamas and Hezbollah.
Secretary.
Yes, he's right. He's right about that, and we take every effort to ensure that that is not the case. I have to say, though, in this circumstance, for a war that has gone on for a year, for the human suffering that is visible in Gaza, for the many young children who are out of school and walking around in squalor, it has always been the case that military effort alone would not bring this to an end. Only politics can do that. And I worry greatly about those young people growing up in the years ahead with vengeance in their heart, and very, very sadly, a repetition of what we have seen.
Uma Kumaran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The United Nations Acting Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator has released a statement that has said hospitals have been hit, health workers have been detained, shelters have been emptied and burned down, first responders have been prevented from rescuing people under the rubble, tens of thousands of people have been killed. It's a shocking and terrifying statement. It goes on to say the entire population of northern Gaza is at risk of dying. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that the UK will use its role as chair of the UN Security Council in November to push for urgent progress on humanitarian access, the protection of civilians, freeing the hostages and bringing to end this terrible conflict?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that question? I wish that it were the case that this war would come to an end and that we would have a ceasefire before we are chair of the UN Security Council next month. But I fear that may not be the case. And can I reassure her that I will be going to New York myself to press the issues as she puts them.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yair Golan is an Israeli politician who only last month was at Labour Party's conference and had meetings with both MPs and photo opportunities, which included the Foreign Secretary and the Minister for the Middle East. This is the same Israeli politician who said late last year that starving to death is completely legitimate in the Israeli press. Given the entire population of northern Gaza on the brink of famine, and has been described repeatedly here today by the Under-Secretary-General for the UN Chief, is at the brink of dying, can the Foreign Secretary sanction Yair Golan, as well as the already stated aim of considering sanctioning Bezalel Smotrich for justifying starving Palestinians as a weapon of war?
Foreign Secretary.
The honourable gentleman makes his point effectively, and these issues are being kept under review.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given that the government suspended only 30 out of 350 arms export licences, including components critical to offensive F-35 fighter jets, without which Israel would be unable to conduct its genocidal assault in Gaza and in Lebanon, could the Foreign Secretary tell me how this exemption of offensive weaponry is consistent with the UK's international obligations, including under the Arms Trade Treaty, and if the government has engaged in discussions with the US government, Lockheed Martin or other F-35 partner countries about implementing tracking and tracing for UK manufactured F-35 components or spare parts that are destined for Israel but licensed for export to third countries?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the honourable lady that I stand by the carve-out that we did for F-35s, and that's because there are other theatres of conflict, important theatres of conflict around the world that this House has discussed at length and will continue to discuss at length. And I am not prepared to bring down planes that are saving lives in other theatres. I'm just not prepared to do that, and that is why we made the decision that we did, and I stand by it. It was the right decision.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, as on other occasions recently, we've heard comments from the benches opposite that suggest that Israel is somehow conducting a war of annihilation, extermination and of genocide. There is obviously much suffering in Gaza, and we all accept that, but this terminology is completely inappropriate, not accurate, and is repeated by the protesters and the lawbreakers who are intimidating British Jews, as we saw again this weekend. So will the Foreign Secretary take this opportunity to say that there is not a genocide occurring in the Middle East?
Foreign Secretary.
These are quite properly legal terms that must be determined by international courts. But I do agree with the Honourable Gentleman. Those terms were largely used when millions of people lost their lives in crises like Rwanda, the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the way that they are used now undermines the seriousness of that term.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement this afternoon, which is very welcome. Given the way in which we expect the Knesset to vote on the issue of UNRWA today, will he, if that decision goes the way that it seems to be going, where Israel will make it very difficult, if not impossible, for UNRWA to operate, with the consequence that humanitarian aid will not get into Gaza, is that not the point at which we have to consider serious sanctions against those who are the proponents of such action?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Lady asks a very serious question. Can I just say to her, as I said a little earlier, that in speaking to Foreign Minister Katz, he was at pains to tell me that just because Parliament had enacted this, it did not mean, or the Knesset, sorry, had enacted this, it did not mean that it would be implemented necessarily by the government. But yes, the truth is, if UNRWA is brought to its knees, that would be a very, very serious event indeed.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Emily Damari was shot, abducted, and is still in captivity. She's the last British hostage held in Gaza. She's literally one of our own. I'm sure the Foreign Secretary will join me in commending Mandy and her family for all their efforts to get her released. Now, as a positive move that we could make, we are due to have a very high-level Qatari delegation coming in a few weeks' time. Normally, when we have these delegations, things are arranged in advance. So could the Foreign Secretary prevail on the Qatari officials to do all they can to get Hamas to release the last British hostage and all of the hostages that are held in captivity in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for raising Mandy Damari and Emily Damari, who I keep in my front of mind in everything I do in this arena to bring about that ceasefire. Mandy is an amazing woman. I am meeting with the Qataris again tomorrow, and of course I will raise the issues.
Warinda Just.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement to the House. We have been calling for a ceasefire for some time now, but innocent civilians continue to die and be maimed in Gaza. The situation has got worse, not better. Would the Foreign Secretary therefore agree with me that now is the time for us to do more and go further?
Well, we continue to do more. The best way to do that is working with our major allies. That's why we put out a statement just yesterday with our allies on the humanitarian situation in UNRWA particularly. And yes, when we're chairing the UN Security Council next month, I will continue to do as much as I can.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary naturally says that we need to prevent escalation in the conflict between Israel and Iran, but as he says, that conflict is being driven by Iran using a network of proxies in the Arab world. So, a genuine question for the Foreign Secretary, does he understand why Israel is increasingly thinking that they need to go after the head of the octopus rather than defending themselves against its tentacles? Or does he think that Israel should never take steps to deter Iran directly?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I say with all seriousness that I am pleased to have urged restraint on Israel in the last few weeks and to have seen their measured response to Iran, and that on the scale of attacks that they could have made on Iran, that rightly they stuck with stockpiles and military sites, and that did not then progress to oil, gas and nuclear sites, because I believe that that would have been escalatory in nature.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. More than 400,000 people, over half of whom are women and children, are estimated by the UN to have been displaced from Lebanon into Syria since September, the majority of those having initially been displaced by the Syrian civil war. In 2013, I witnessed the dignified resilience of civilians fleeing the Syrian conflict in the Domi's refugee camp in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and I recall that they were assisted by aid from the British government and British NGOs. So can my right honourable friend confirm that the UK is providing additional support to women and girls fleeing the conflict in Lebanon, who are, as ever, paying the price of war?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. I can confirm that we are supporting those fleeing Lebanon into Syria at this time, and recognising the very fragile position that Syria is in, let alone what is now happening in Lebanon. He should definitely have that reassurance.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary would have heard from the member for Argyll earlier when he quoted Joyce Masuya, the humanitarian chief of the UN, who says, and I quote, "The entire population of northern Gaza is at risk of dying, on top of the 1,000 that died last week, on top of all those living in the most desperate situation in southern Gaza, on top of the occupation of southern Lebanon, the bombing of southern Beirut, and now the dangers of a hot war with Iran and Israel. Isn't it time that instead of expressing concern about the humanitarian catastrophe in the region, we stopped supplying Israel with the weapons that have caused the humanitarian catastrophe in the first place, and we suspend arms supplies in total to Israel in order to bring about a ceasefire and a cessation of this, frankly, murder of an innocent civilian population?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I know the strength of feeling that my neighbour in North London has on these issues and is long-standing campaigning on these issues. But can I just assure him that we're not just wringing our hands. The work of UK Med in hospitals is hugely important, and I was very pleased to make further funds available to them in coming into office. The work of the Disasters Emergency Committee in raising further funds and the way in which government has match funded that to the tune of 10 million is hugely important. It was great and very good to be in Jordan a few weeks ago discussing with King Abdullah his airlifts into Jordan and the planning that he's getting from UK armed forces in organising those airlifts and that air bridge that he has been keen to take forward. So it's not just, these are actions, these are real things that we're doing, not just the wringing of hands. And when he describes the situation in Gaza, he largely describes much that I said in my opening in this debate. And as I said before, and I'll say again, we have suspended arms that could be used in contravention of international humanitarian law. where there is a clear risk according to our export licensing regime, and he should be reassured that we've done that.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Words are simply not enough. Words are not enough to describe the devastation of Gaza. Words of my right honourable friend are not enough to open those borders to allow humanitarian aid to flow. And words are not enough for my right honourable friend to stop the Israeli government acting with impunity across Gaza. And particularly, we think of the north at this time and the struggles we hear there. So could my right honourable friend say what he is doing to expedite the work of the International Criminal Court and the Court of Justice to ensure that they have all the resources to speed up the work to call these criminals exercising such devastation over Gaza to account?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I reassure the Honourable Lady that I met with the Chief Prosecutor a few weeks ago, and that we continue to support the ICC, and as she knows, we have been very, very clear on our own views and beliefs in the support of the rule of law and international humanitarian law particularly, and that both the ICC and the ICJ should be able to go about their work unfettered by political, political intervention.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary very much for his statement and for his tone as well. I think it should be admired. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary, he has rightly stated the precarious situation that the Middle East teeters upon. However, whilst it seems that Iran has dialed back the rhetoric for now, how will the Foreign Secretary encourage the Iranians and the IRGC, because that's very important, to dial back on their actions, not simply against Israel, but against their own people who are on their knees, subject to the terrible and horrific and brutal human rights abuses and persecution? In the face of this horrific regime, how can we help the ordinary Iranians and Israelis to live a life free from war? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful for the question. I've emphasised my conversation with the Israeli Foreign Minister yesterday, but I should also emphasise my conversation with the Iranian Foreign Minister yesterday. And I talked to him about restraint. I talked to him about our concerns in relation to the support for proxies, and I raised the nuclear question and the snapback clause that comes into play next year if we aren't able to progress with our E3 partners, our further conversations with Iran.
Andrew Pakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Minister knows, this is a critical time for the Middle East. I think this House would speak as one with the message of an end to the violence, releasing the hostages and getting the aid in. The humanitarian crisis facing the Palestinian people, though, will only be made worse if the Israeli government carries out its threat to shut down, in effect, UNRWA. I welcome the government's utter condemnation and rejection of these plans, but what reassurances can he give my constituents in this House that this government won't only talk tough in the region, but will also take action to protect lives if the Israeli government persists with these plans?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's right to raise UNRWA. It's why this government restored the funding to UNRWA. It's why we gave them a further £21 million, but it's also why 1 million of that was used to help them implement the reforms of Madame Colonna. It would be a catastrophe to see the end of UNRWA. It would be wholly counterproductive for Israel, by the way. The situation on the occupied territories is fragile as it is. To take away UNRWA, I think, would be catastrophic. And so for all of those reasons, I've urged the Israeli government to step back and not implement what has passed through its Knesset.
Graham Downey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A year ago, despite undoubted challenges, there were early signs of improved relations between Israel, the Gulf states and others, who are all pressing Israel to move towards a two-state solution that everyone in this House would like to see. The Iranian regime, however, through its own actions and those of its proxies, has succeeded in engulfing the region into chaos and conflict and causing many of the disasters which we've heard about in the House this afternoon. Can I ask the Secretary of State what is being done in partnership with our Gulf state allies to counter this activity and bring stability and the prospect of regional peace back to the area?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful for that question. I was in Jordan a few weeks ago speaking with King Abdullah and my Jordanian counterpart about their air bridge proposal and the planning that we've helped them with to ensure that they can at least drop aid into Gaza. I've obviously been speaking to the Qataris and the Egyptians about the efforts to bring about a hostage deal, ceasefire deal with their relations particularly or their roots into Hamas. And of course we continue to speak to the Saudis and to others in the region to try and bring about that peace. And it's a peace that I have no doubt that Arab partners want to play a role in, but they will only be able to play a role if there is a proper path to a two-state solution.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend will be aware that there is growing concern that Israel may attempt to illegally annex northern Gaza, including from organisations such as Medical Aid for Palestinians and Action for Humanity. Can my right honourable friend confirm if the government has raised these concerns with the Israeli government and outline what action this government will take should these concerns become a reality?
Foreign Secretary.
I have raised those concerns. They would be illegal and they would be wrong, and the UK government would view them with the seriousness that it deserves.
James Asser.
Every day I'm contacted by my constituents increasingly distressed at the scenes we're seeing from Gaza and growing concern over the situation which is rapidly deteriorating in the north of Gaza, where the situation is now utterly appalling. Can I urge the Foreign Secretary to make sure the government is using every measure it has available, including working with our international partners to get a resolution to the situation, but to prioritise getting humanitarian aid and medical relief into Gaza, especially the north of Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, thank you for raising the work with our other international partners, which is so important. It was why, a few weeks ago, I joined the Canadian Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, in speaking to the Israelis. It's why also I went to Israel with my French colleague to speak to the Israelis. Time and time again, it's working in a coordinated way with allies that you have greater effect.
Luke Charters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Iran's monstrous state sponsorship of Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis is a fundamental driver of the conflict we see in Gaza, Lebanon and the Red Sea retrospectively. What steps can my right honourable friend confirm to the House that this government are undertaking to undermine Iran's financial, military and logistical support for these terrorist proxies?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that since coming into office we've had 3 batches of sanctions against Iran. Now over 450 nationals are under UK sanctions.
Dan Tomlinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic. So can the Foreign Secretary please update the House on the work that the government is doing to provide more aid and to make sure that it gets to those who need it?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, he's right. The humanitarian situation is dire. It's why I was at pains to emphasise what we are doing. It was important that we led the way on getting the pause so that children could be vaccinated against polio, I was very distressed to see that that pause broken just a few days ago, but we're urging for it to be lifted once more so that those children can get their second vaccination dose. It's why the work of UK Med is very important. It's why the DEC appeal at this time is very important, and it's why we will continue to support people who are sick and injured in being evacuated from the area as well.
Final question, Paul Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The suffering of the people of Palestine and northern Gaza is truly horrific. Every day, children are not just being bombed, they're being starved. That's not the kind of treatment I'd expect for our children, let alone any other country's children. So will the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it's time that Israel cease to use food and hunger and siege as weapons of war, all contrary to international law, and for them to be given that message loud and clear by this House?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes. The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and he will recall that when I suspended arms sales that could be used in Gaza, the criteria under our regime is a clear risk that there could be a breach of international humanitarian law. And when I was looking at the assessments, I kept coming back to humanitarian access as the clear risk. So he's absolutely right that we have tremendous concerns about the inability of aid to be able to get in, the restrictions that Israel is putting in place, and the starvation, the man-made starvation that is now coming about as a result.
That brings that statement to an end, and we'll take a few moments whilst the front benches swap over. I would just like to take this opportunity to remind members, if they wish to contribute